Great. Nice to see everybody here today, and both familiar faces and some new faces, and just grateful to be here. My name is Danielle, as Horton introduced, and I'm with my colleague Brian here. We both have our matching backgrounds, and our webinar is on advancing JEDI, which is an acronym for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Efforts through QE. And so as we get started, we'll kind of give a little bit of outline of what we're planning to review today. So we're going to start with a little bit of some context and then go through a worked example using QE, and then an application of findings, like what does this mean? And so with that, we'll go ahead and get started with a little bit of introduction and background. So just to be upfront, our aims for this webinar is a little more pragmatic and a little bit beyond just reviewing a study. And so we'll talk about a short analysis we did, but we're not really going to be highlighting the technical aspects. Like, I'm not going to be talking about the really cool new unit circle functionality, but we'll instead be challenging ourselves to think about greater impact of the research that we do. As we do that, though, we want to share a little bit about our background, as it might be helpful to share why we're interested in this kind of work related to JEDI, which is one acronym of many. There are several other acronyms, but we chose this one because it also sounds cool. But so I currently work at Pepperdine here in the United States, working on research involving cross-cultural contexts, but also at a fine art institution to support programming for museum exhibitions. But I'm involved with several efforts there, like the Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion Council. Again, that's another acronym for a similar topic for today. And in that work, I'm focused on institution-wide efforts, specifically in programming to help educate the institution on anti-racism. I'm also a part of the bilingual working group to find ways to make aspects more bilingual in the institution. And prior to this, I've also worked many years in higher ed and had the opportunity to do a lot of inclusion work with economically diverse student populations. And specifically, there was an instance when I was at an institution. Two things that took place that really shaped my experience was a report on race, and the institution was released exactly 15 years to the day yesterday, essentially calling out the need to recognize and address race challenges within the institution. And then days later, there was a tragic shooting that came to overshadow the situation. So I was starting at a time where the students that I was supporting, especially within this multicultural affairs division I was working with, was facing like this double hurt. And that experience of advocacy for the student populations, especially those in the Jewish and the Black and LGBTQ student communities, have really remained with me. And as a reminder that just because you aren't personally experiencing particular prejudice and oppression doesn't mean that it isn't happening. And it's really important to give space to voices to actually listen and to do something about it. And so I'll also invite Brian to share a little bit about his background and interest in this work.
Thank you, Danielle. It's really an honor to be here. As Morton mentioned, I teach at Riverside City College and have also been involved in museum work as a curator for the last decade. And these two pathways of being a professor, an academic art historian, and a museum curator have run parallel to each other. But when Danielle introduced me to David Schaefer's book a few years ago, it felt really life-changing in a way, because it was the first instance where I felt like the kind of quantitative data that we so often present in the academy and also in a museum context lose sight of the human-centered stories. And as a queer non-binary individual who has interest in histories of race and indigenous presence, both in the past and in the present, these were stories that were so often lost in the data sets that were presented in institutions of higher learning or cultural competency. And I was tired of seeing communities compressed to numbers or to bar graphs without a clear sense of what is the emotional impact on our communities of the work that we're doing. When we talk about culturally responsive teaching, pedagogy, curatorial work, we so often, I feel, from the studies that have been presented over the last decade or so, lose that human piece. We're often given long lists of strategies to employ, engage with communities, work and network with those leaders in your field, without looking at the more specific qualitative stories that can shed, I think, a lot of light on the kind of intersectional work that I hope many of us in these institutions are committed to doing, but that also gets so lost in the aggregated data that we present. So I also feel like a real outlier in this work, as it's still very new for me, and I don't work well in mathematical sort of circumstances. So Danielle has been a great mentor, and I'm grateful to be here.
Brian, you're so awesome. We are grateful. And just so you know, we are always welcoming of you bring so much to the table, and so grateful for you to be here and be opening to share this part of our world with the rest of the community. So now that you know a little bit about us and why we care about this work, our goal is to showcase how qualitative stories with using QE can help be relevant to policy change. And we're going to share one specific example, which is an analysis of posts on social media that are relevant to the workplace environment in the arts museum context, because that is the crossover for Brian and I to speak from. So to kind of rewind, in 2020, global pandemic we're all very aware of, and in the middle of that, middle of 2020 in the United States, there was the murder of George Floyd, which brought a renewed discourse on racism to the forefront, including work spaces. And there was an Instagram account that emerged where museum employees, past and present, could anonymously submit their experiences of racism and exclusion. And we didn't just want this to be a passing trend, but find a way to document the phenomena in a scholarly way and give it a voice that couldn't be ignored. So then we looked at the Instagram account, which is called Change the Museum. We have an acronym of CTM for short. And we wanted to, as proof of this initial analysis and proof of concept of this analysis, we looked at the first 2 months of where we saw a rapid amount of posts, which was in June and July of 2020. As we read the posts, some of the posts were generalized and didn't really speak to a specific lived experience. So what we did was we separated the posts that were more general statements versus the ones that were recalling a particular experience. And we focused on the latter, where the utterance owned the experience, which was usually with an I statement. And so looking at those experienced posts, it came to about 190, so like around 200. And from those owned experiences, there were two types. There were these personal accounts where the submitter themselves was the direct target of the action, versus the observed accounts, which were the submitter observed something, but they were not the direct or only target of the action. And each of these posts were very rich in description and often very painful to read. And I'll pass it over to Brian to share a little bit about some of the examples of the data.
Yeah, as Danielle said, I mean, reading through the data set and visiting the Instagram account, you'll see that the personal accounts tend to be the ones that are the most either triggering or bring up a lot of experiences with trauma within the institution. Those observed experiences, though, also highlight the trauma from the outside perspective and the connections that are drawn between the individual that has experienced the microaggression or the hostile work environment, the harassment, the sexism, racism, etc., is still there, but often linked in the observed context to other individuals or to institutional structures. And then on the personal level, we do often read more about the individuals within the institution, the director, the supervisor, the manager, and the fear piece that comes out on an emotional level. The personal accounts reveal the concern about retaliation and so forth. So these are just two examples. As Danielle mentioned, they're rich with descriptors that allowed us to form the code book based on the kinds of utterances. And we had the benefit of looking across the entire first year of posts. So we had a sense of what kinds of themes or utterances would emerge over the course of a year, but then limiting our initial data set to that first month and a half allowed us to really focus on what were the major issues coming to the fore at a time when museums were also grappling with how to respond internally and externally in light of the death of George Floyd and others. Danielle, is there more to add on this one?
Oh, I think you covered it.
So we did form a code book starting with, and we acknowledge here that these represent the aggregated categories, and that the disaggregation of a category like race does allow us to look at Black staff members, Latinx staff members, Asian staff members, and so forth, the same way that the gender category can allow us to look at men, women, non-binary, queer, and trans staff. Employment was a term that dealt with all aspects of the job related to hiring, advancement, recruitment. The theme of ignorance came up a number of times, which either referred to this lack of knowledge or experience about an issue, or a lack of care and empathy. And I think that element of empathy really emerged strongly the more we look at the experience over time. Microaggressions gradually came across either implicitly or explicitly in the kind of data that was recorded in the utterances, whether these were communicating hostile or derogatory negative attitudes, language that was meant to dehumanize culturally marginalized groups. We also looked at positional influence, and this is one that we could further disaggregate on a number of levels. We initially saw posts about supervisors, senior leadership, board members, but initially we didn't look at donors, volunteers, or those that are not directly funded by or employed by the institution. But we gather over time, looking at this data set, we'll be able to look more critically, I think, at the role that these individuals play in issues related to race, hiring, advancement, and so forth. One of the major points that we see over the first month and a half, but more so over the first year, is this fear for retaliation and fear for even speaking up about race-related discrimination in the workplace as a factor that might lead to further retaliation. And then with that, the fear of tokenism, whether tokenism comes in the form of putting people of color or individuals in traditionally marginalized groups onto councils, like the one that Danielle mentioned, the Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion Council, and the way in which that might relate to fetishization or increased workload, I think is one that we see over the course of the first year that didn't necessarily come up in the first month and a half. Anything more there, Danielle?
That's great.
Perfect.
So we'll just dive into some of the models that were from this initial analysis, again, covering that June and July period. And when we look at this, the ones with the personal posts that are on the left here in blue, and then the observed on the right that are in red, they might seem similar at first, but then you realize that the personal posts are connected to more constructs, like the retaliation, the gender, and employment, which indicates that there are these hidden issues that are occurring, while the observed posts highlight the very visible issues that connects the race to ignorance and positional influence. And so I think we have on the next slide, the subtractive model, where you can see those differences a bit more, that there is a difference between the two. And so looking at this, what does this mean? What's the relevance of this? So we're essentially seeing these complementary patterns of hidden issues relating to gender, employment, and retaliation with the personal posts compared to the observed posts. And on the next slide, we'll see just some comments here, but really, the implication is that in order to really see the fuller picture of the issues that are happening, we need to create spaces where people can call out observed behavior to support one another, but also to empower personal accounts of firsthand experiences to come forward. So we can't be focused on just one or the other, but both. So for example, we can't just have an unconscious bias training for everybody. We need to also have mechanisms in place where people can report behavior that doesn't just go into the void to make people feel better that they're reporting something. Like it also needs to have some action with it. So the importance of having both. So on the next slide, we'll see that what are some other things that we can look at. So this was just an initial analysis, and we are still working on looking at over the course of 1 year, as Brian has been mentioning. We kind of looked at it preliminarily, and we're in the middle of trying to finish looking at a full year of posts, and to kind of see what additional concerns and themes emerge from this. We're also interested in doing some regional comparisons among the cities. Now, the posts are limited in the data because they don't necessarily always identify that it's with a particular location, but for at least the ones that we do, hopefully we're able to compare. In addition, there are more movements than just the Change the Museum Instagram account. And so if we're able to do the similar analysis with other movements, we can also see where do the trends overlap and whatnot. And perhaps another more interesting thing we would really love to do in the future is to compare it with the actual plans that museums have released since then, in response actually to not necessarily Change the Museum, but just the trends at the time to respond to these concerns with the institution regarding diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. And so it would be interesting to do an analysis of those plans to see if they compare to things that were raised in Change the Museum, even though museums don't openly address or acknowledge that Change the Museum even exists or existed. So again, let's say we do all this analysis, but then what do we do with the results of these examinations? And it's really important. Obviously, you want to use this to catalyze thinking and in turn policy change. And to support that dissemination piece is very important, not just to the academic setting, which is what we're used to. We'll have a study, we'll put it in a journal and whatnot, but making this connection to practice in order to raise that awareness and trying to transfer that to broad publications and social media, and also sharing the work with practitioners so that way they can spread the word about it as well. And with that, I want to pass it over to Brian to talk a little bit more about some additional thoughts that we had and how this approach got us thinking about even more steps in an analysis.
I think the point that Danielle has raised, starting with these other movements, the Art and Museum Transparency that looks at salary transparency in the art museum across positions, or museums are not neutral, that ask institutions to take a critical look at their positionality as a collecting and displaying or exhibiting institution. The language that's often used in those plans or that comes across in these other movements calls out institutions for not following the SMART acronym for goal setting, that they're often not specific enough or measurable enough, even achievable enough. They do often feel relevant and time-bound or time-sensitive, but they lack some of those other core elements. And we see that also in the institutional cultural climate surveys of many of these institutions, where they're already gathering large amounts of data from staff that always include a free-fielded section for staff to comment on further some of the questions that have been asked. And yet it's that data that is so often missing. It's the qualitative assessment that is often thrown out or is only seen at the highest level. And so when a staff reads out these plans, either a DEAI plan or the institutional cultural climate survey results, we again see ourselves in boxes or categories or lines on a bar graph, not understanding that for Black employees in New York, and Black women specifically, there are salary discrepancies and also high level of turnover and lack of advancement. That naturally, of course, comes out in the Change the Museum post. When you add the emotional trauma and the labor piece to that is read in the Change the Museum piece, you then, I think, have a model for empathy institutionally that can help leadership and everyone across the board better understand their role in the workplace and creating that culture. So when a DEAI museum plan says we are going to champion a culture of acceptance, that can't be measured really, except perhaps in the qualitative data of how are people feeling accepted? Are they feeling safe coming to work? Often those anecdotes are dismissed, as we've seen in leadership, and even some of the studies that I'll refer to later. Leadership specifically dismisses anecdotes, as they've dismissed Change the Museum, because they're seen as singular, not necessarily reflective of broader groups. And yet these surveys or these plans, on the one hand, do reflect at least the institutional climate, and then the plans themselves should align with the climate in some ways. So I think that's what we're seeing, is the tension by cultural institutions to resist Change the Museum and other initiatives like these as being complaint outlets and not seeing the real wealth of information that comes across. There's also obvious connections to population and demographics in a community. So it won't be surprising that in Los Angeles, we see a greater amount of posts by Latinx or Latina individuals about their treatment in museums. That then, unsurprising statistical data point, I would think, could inform leadership when they have a statement in a plan that says, commit to hiring people of color. You now have evidence of where people of color in your institution are already feeling the trauma of being employed or are feeling the microaggressions. And so to create or champion a space, you have in a way, a wealth of personal data that should, I think, provide a pathwork forward. Was that clear, Danielle, from what we said earlier? Okay. Yeah. Did you want me to move on to the next examples then?
Yeah, please, yes.
So as an academic art historian and museum employee, I'm very used to this idea of past forecasting, looking at a literature review or a lit analysis. And in my mind, it was sort of both revelatory to learn this quantitative ethnographic approach, but also maddening at the same time, because in a way, what we read on Change the Museum should not have been surprising. And the statements that museums issued in light of the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and numerous others should also not have come at the time that they did, because museums have, for at least the last decade, already been acknowledging the need to engage communities in a participatory model, like Nina Simon's 2010 volume, or in 2012, the foundation of something called the Incluseum, which provided and continues to provide updated bibliography, studies, assessments, demographic surveys, participant models that help provide a groundwork for museums to be more inclusive, with precisely the kinds of language that we're reading now in these plans for diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. Commit to bilingual translation of labels and programming. Well, this is evidence that we've known in the museum education field for well over a decade. And ditto then in 2017 and 2019, when trends like the Museum Are Not Neutral campaign emerges on social media, we already had years of evidence about how visitors of color and staff of color feel within the space. And so there was something of a catalyzing moment in 2020, of course, of all these factors on a global level coming together. And yet I say that it was sort of maddening to think with quantitative ethnography, because in a way we've already known the direction that museums should be taking. And so it was in a way ironic that just days before 2020, the International Council of Museums and the Association of Art Museum Curators released a study about the state of DEAI practices in museums that was attempting to provide a pathway forward. And then moving into 2020, the American Alliance of Museums released their study about diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion based on a 7-year working group model. So we go into our lockdowns of early 2020 with all of this information. And then by the middle of the year, Change the Museum emerges. And very quickly, museums grappled with issuing statements to respond to the kind of public outcry that institutions reflect upon the trauma in our world and become safe spaces. And so the studies that have come out since Change the Museum emerged, not referencing Change the Museum though, are books like Museums as Agents of Change by Mike Morawski, a wonderful study of the last 10 plus years of museums as sites of change. But even he acknowledges in many of his chapters that museums aggregate data and present strategies for change that are often not able to be measured, defining who your community is, developing community advisory groups, creating partnerships, but not allowing the disaggregated data of the emotional piece of those communities to shine through. That's the piece that's missing from white papers. It's the piece that is acknowledged at the high end, that when you form, for example, a partnership with your community, ensure that those partnerships develop at the beginning. And the anecdotal evidence that comes across in one example, working with Indigenous communities, if you involve elders, leaders, change makers 5 years into a longer strategic plan, you've missed opportunities to think intentionally about these relationships. And so it's often, I think, the human-centered piece that gets lost because we're committed to either a list of strategies or the data in very discrete categories that again misses the intersectional piece. And to that point, Sarah Ahmed's book, Complaint, although it doesn't deal with museum sector specifically, but rather higher education or other institutions of learning, and the way in which women specifically who raise concerns about sexual harassment, sexual assault, sexual violence are often dismissed. And she says, diversity is often where you end up in institutions. We often end up on the diversity committee because of who we are. We are not men, not white, not cisgender, not able-bodied. The more nots that we are, the more committees we end up on. If you end up on the diversity committee, then you can end up under more surveillance. When you mention terms like race, sexuality, and gender, you're seen as a complainer. So she's aggregated and then disaggregated a decade's worth of data that again can be a roadmap for museums forward. And because it's published with a university press like Mike Morawski's book, these are the books being discussed in major conferences in the museum world, in both education, curatorial, and beyond. And so I think part of the goal that Danielle and I have come to is that we want to really see the value of Change the Museum, because we want to believe those who are complaining or those that are speaking up, those that are speaking out, that they're inviting institutions into a conversation and not just calling out the behaviors of trauma, aggression, and so forth. And that as Sarah Ahmed and Mike Morawski and a number of others from the early origins of feminism to the present have said that institutional critique is the highest form of gratitude and generosity towards an institution, because you're creating this space for change. And if the institution can commit to change, then we can move forward. We may never fully erase the barriers of racism within an institution, which 5 of the 12 museum plans state that in a 5-year period, they hope to erase racism within an institution. That is likely impossible, but listening to staff and listening to these experiences, we feel is one way forward. So I realize I'm going long now. I wanted to give one additional sort of application, because this model, as I mentioned at the beginning, has really excited me. And I think of curriculum applications and pipeline modeling, because institutions of higher learning and museums often use the term pipeline in a kind of nebulous way. And what I was starting to look at years ago as a curator was, how can I be more strategic in the exhibitions that I put on and the acquisitions that I propose based on what's being taught in our classes? And I looked at the model of Smart History, which is a digital open educational resource, the Center for Public Art History, that years ago created robust content for the AP, or the Advanced Placement Exam of Art History. 250 objects across world art histories with robust content that could be accessed anywhere in the world. Looking at that information alongside state standards for assessment in the history, social studies field, and then looking at the population demographics, noticing that in 4th grade and 7th grade in California and in 38 states across the United States, learn about the medieval period, again, my area of specialization, that within my region, that constitutes over 460,000 4th grade bodies that come from a minimum of 460,000 households or family units or community networks, that might we be able to better focus on the kinds of themes that come up in the curriculum, such as models of kingship, themes of identity, trade, travel. And so I mounted this exhibition about India in 2018, and it stemmed from community engagement, working with communities of Jain, Buddhist, Hindu, and other religious groups, people from India, immigrants, religious communities, and so forth. And I felt excited about this project because it was community driven. But after the exhibition opened, my colleague and I, who both mounted exhibits at the same time, were critiqued because we didn't introduce the history of Sikhism. And it wasn't that we didn't introduce the history of Sikhism, but that we overlooked, intentionally or unintentionally, the vast Sikh population in Los Angeles, and the very fact that in 2017, Sikhism was introduced as a cultural competency standard in the California education units. The very same units that I was looking to for medieval history were also introducing Sikhism. So trying to learn from that with another project that is now a publication coming out later this year about Black figures in European art and histories of kingship in a global context. My colleague and I have invited 10 additional scholars on early modern history, on race, on kingship, to begin each of their essays in this volume on biography, because biography is another standard in the California and US standard curriculum for the medieval. If we start from the place of biography, we can still engage themes of race, travel, trade, kingship, and so forth. But what I'm interested in at this point is the way in which these standards are presenting these narratives and how we could use models that I'm seeing in other fields, in STEM specifically, and other studies that Brendan and Danielle have shared, Amanda Siebert-Evanstone, and Professor Schaefer's work on science standards. I think we've talked a lot in the humanities about what content is presented, but not the methods through which the content is presented, the narratives that are put out there, and also, more importantly, in my mind, the student responses. When introducing topics of race, what are the trigger points or the trauma points for students of color? When we talk about sexual violence towards women in positions of leadership as part of our standards, what is the impact in teaching those histories? Why is it that LGBTQIA2+ histories, or queer and trans histories more broadly, are not introduced at all, when we know from our fields of study that these histories are relevant and have been around since time immemorial? So as we're working on new curricular models, I think listening to the student voices and the student responses is as important to guide and direct our work moving forward.
Thanks so much, Brian. So right now we've gotten really specific in using the museum setting as an example, but we hope that perhaps sharing this example can help think about what perhaps are other contexts that this approach might be able to help advance the JEDI themed work. And perhaps we were trying to think about what's another takeaway to keep in mind with this particular kind of topic. And it's really just a reminder to find relevancy with the people who are involved in the practice, right? If engaging with those conversations because they might know data sources that you don't know about, and also involving them in the interpretation of the data. I know that we have obviously the movement of participatory QE within the community, but also inviting the practitioners to help with the showing them results, but also coming up with the implications that can also help strengthen and help our findings to be more well-rounded. And then also, if they can contribute and be authors, those individuals can help disseminate the work to people who perhaps might not normally have checked out the article and whatnot, and broaden the reach. So that's kind of that is our presentation so far, and we're grateful for all of you. And I know that we have some questions in the chat, and I honestly forgot that there was a chat window, so we'll kind of perhaps start to get to those. But Morten, feel free to, if you want to get us started.
I'll just say, I can say something. I can say thank you very much. I mean, this was very interesting and inspiring, and for me also a wonderful political take, in a sense. I mean, you are actually trying to create change using QE. I find that very interesting. We have a number of questions in the chat already, so I'll jump right to them. Alexis, you have a question for Danielle. Maybe you want to phrase it yourself. I can, if you're not there. I think it's an interesting.
No, I'm
question.
here. I'm here. Yeah, it's interesting because I knew Danielle's work before, but it's interesting that it has turned into activism. So I just was wondering what year and what event. I mean, I know you mentioned George Floyd, but was that in 2020 when you were inspired to do anti-racism research, or was it long before? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think so. Brian and I actually were on this council together, and we both observed this trend of change the museum. And while it's something that informed our practice, we hadn't crossed, and I had not crossed the two parts of my world of the research side and doing the practice side. And so Change the Museum offered that opportunity to kind of merge the two together. So that's really where this started. I wouldn't bill us to be experts by any means, but we're just trying to give voice to the phenomena that we see are happening. So I hope that's kind of the short version of that.
Great. And what year did you start that?
Probably in early 2021.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And Kai, you have this very a wonderful, clear question. What about the data? What's the average post?
Yeah, the question I'm asking is when I look at the ENA network, I feel like, is that just because the length of the posts different? It looks like because if the observed posts are shorter, they may tend just to be more brave on the on the right points. I'm just wondering.
Sure, no, that's a great question. So, and Brian, feel free to chime in, but most of the posts are about a paragraph in length, and some are a little bit longer. But actually, though, so we ended up separating between personal and observed, and they're pretty similar because some observed posts, some of them were long, but so were the personal ones. But most of them generally are about a paragraph, so not too different in size, I would say. Because we did take out all the general posts, like if something was just like, oh, such and such institution like delivered a message of this, it's not really a observed experience. But
I think, Danielle, didn't we also notice that for the personal, we often read more about a timeline of the events? These were longer standing issues, whereas the observed often tended to be a moment. There were a few over time that we noticed. I think as more personal posts were shared, then some of the observed posts could corroborate that having worked at the institution for 15 years, I've witnessed these initiatives to X, Y, and Z towards diversity, and could see the impact on Latinx communities, for example. So I think there were a few like that over time started to make these broader overarching themes about their own length at the institution, perhaps that they didn't realize, maybe because the personal were so specific about over my 5 years as X or in my 10 years at the institution.
So yeah, so it's kind of both, yeah, the parallel.
But the good question here is, of course, if there's another difference than the richness of the discourse, maybe it's, I mean, simply because the post is longer, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So Gaul, you have a question about the ENA models. I mean, you would like to look more at the models, or what? I mean, can you state the question, Gaul?
Yeah, I would love to hear more about the models. So you showed that subtracted network, and it looked like there was a difference. But I mean, I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about the difference, and if you had a chance to close that interpretive loop and kind of let us in on that, if that was the case. And what I mean by that is, do you have some examples from the data that can explain some of these connections and help interpret some of these connections? If you're there yet. If not, that's okay.
Sure. I feel like we've talked about it, Brian.
Well, wasn't the one that immediately came to mind when you asked this excellent question is that so often, for example, was it employment and retaliation in relation to race? That so often one of the challenges in some of the posts where they wouldn't name the city or the institution is that they may be the only woman of color or Black woman specifically or Latinx individual in the institution. And so for them to speak out publicly, giving evidence about where they're working or the institution or even the city could lead to retaliation or loss of employment or lack of advancement. And so I think that might explain some of those connections.
And Brian, sorry to interrupt
sure.
you, but to help me understand, can you remind me again, which one was the red and which one was the blue?
In this instance, so red is the observed, right, Danielle? And then blue is personal, as it was, yes. In
okay, got it.
Oops, yeah.
Got it. Okay, blue is personal, red is observed. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I have a question that is somehow...
Was that clear though, Danielle? Was there anything else on that one? I think you probably could say more.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there can be, I apologize to not have more like a fresher ideas. I'm trying to remember also the specific data set we looked at because we've been looking at the other posts. And so it's kind of like coming together. So I think Brian's is a good example.
Okay, I will ask a question because I think, you know, usually when we reading David's book and talking about quantitative ethnography and so on, we think about it as very epistemic and cognitive, right? We are learning something about a data set, something that we couldn't see before. And I think you're doing a little bit of I mean, you're doing that also, but you are also, maybe you have also experimented with using the network for more like rhetorical purposes, or in order to make other people aware, in order to create some change. And I would like to hear your reflection on that, because it's actually quite a different thing if you're trying to find out something for yourself and really what is going on here, right? And if you are trying to bring some knowledge out to the world so that it makes a change, what is your reflection on that? Can QE do something, for instance, in aggregating a number of specific instances in a way where you can actually say, okay, there's a problem here? I mean, or what's your reflection on that?
So you're saying like our hope for
well, hope, I was thinking, I mean, did you show this to someone? Did you post it in a way to make people aware that there's a problem in the sector, and how did people react?
Sure. But I don't know, Brian, if you wanna share, because you're more of the person who's like sharing things on social media. But I will say that on my end, so we did this initial analysis. We're in the middle of doing the longer term analysis, and that's kind of the one we want to promote more, because then we'll have more data points to look at. We did that initial study as kind of a okay, we need to keep going because there is something here. And so right now, this initial work I've shared with colleagues who kind of are part of, who kind of already support kind of these efforts within the institution. And part of the reason why we haven't gone even to the higher up roles is because they're gonna want like more hard hitting, like, well, this is just these two, because right now museum leadership is very dismissive of a phenomena like Change the Museum, and they want, they're not going to pay attention to it unless someone really solidifies it and calls it out in a formal setting. So we want to get our year study out and publish it, so that way there's something solid that we can point to that has gone through peer review. So that's kind of the game plan for us in the longer term right now. And so, but we're also trying to enlist allies to help us in this work, because Brian and I doing it ourselves, we're trying to find other people to kind of help us to continue on and see other points perhaps that we're missing. And so Brian, I'll also leave it to you to kind of tag on also what you've shared and whatnot.
Sure, no, I think you're right. It is sort of using the platform of an academic publication to, in some ways, give credibility to or greater scholarly attention to this otherwise social media phenomenon. And museum leadership and even curatorial and some education circles are often resistant or dismissive of these platforms. Even when something like Change Museums Are Not Neutral emerged in 2017, institutions seemed to resist because it was seen as a passing fad or temporary or somewhat. I mean, I like to the question that you just asked, Morten, I'm thinking Mariah's question in the chat is also really good, because part of what we have discussed in these circles and on these DEI councils or so forth, there is a question about institutions responding in ways that are not, as you've asked, just damage centric, but that also look at themes of desire and resistance. I mean, that's really clear, I think, from what we're seeing in communities of color and in LGBTQ communities that are putting forward stories about the past, that on the one hand, these institutions have not yet grappled with or dealt with these histories of damage or trauma enough to then be able to present the stories of desire and resistance. So on the one hand, it's addressing the structural barriers or challenges internally in order to create a safe space so that you can have, I think, a dialogue to speak about the more positive or uplifting stories. And also within this model, and some of the response to the study that we shared on social media, this initial work, is that these are really painful stories for museums to think about, or these are really difficult stories. And they might be difficult for white audiences. They might be painful, though, for audiences of color. And how does an institution then sit with and sit in that space? I think there's an element of time that's needed as well that we've been thinking about, but that is beyond just the epistemic analysis, I guess.
Okay, thank you, Brian. So just let me hear. Maria, did we cover your question here? Okay, great. So I have Andrew, I have David, and I have Yajung afterwards, right? So Andrew, you go first.
Yeah, thanks. This was really interesting. I really enjoy hearing how you guys are thinking about this issue. And one of the things that your talk has really crystallized for me, and that I've been thinking about for a little while, and I've seen other folks thinking about, in particular the policy folks, is this sense that, like, traditionally ethnography is kind of focused on a specific culture, a specific time, a specific place. And one of the things that QE allows us to do is actually do sort of ethnographic type analyses of sort of whole ecosystems. And I'm using that in the kind of colloquial sense, right? So the policy folks have given this some thought, but I mean, your work is really, I think, very ripe for that kind of analysis, because you're interested in a structural problem that's operating at all of these different levels and through all of these different mechanisms. And we actually have the tools to do that kind of sort of multi-level kind of analysis. And in some ways, Daniel, when you were saying, you could look at museum policies and things like that, you guys are actually looking at an issue that's sort of sitting at the intersection of everything from kind of employment and labor laws and policies, to sort of social, specific social issues, to more, kind of museum-centric, kind of curatorial and display type issues, and sort of all of this. And actually, most of that's out there on some level. It's mostly available, and it strikes me that one of the really important questions here is actually how to integrate that kind of information, because that's I think a very important question, a very hard question, but it's also where you might get the most traction in some ways. You're pointing out, right, that the sort of the resistance that people in positions of power have to even consider these as issues, let alone to consider a solution, or ways to address them. And one of the ways to make that argument is actually to be able to highlight really clearly, to be able to tell that sort of causal story, that simple causal story of this complex situation, using a model that actually pulls all these pieces together, essentially, and can do that. And so I know you guys you're doing sort of step one of what you see as a much larger project, but I am curious, like, how you've been thinking about the way to connect, for example, things like individual lived experience to these much larger structural issues that do often transcend specific times and places and cultures, and yet you don't want to lose that sort of richness of the lived experience and the importance of what people feel. And so I'm curious how you guys are starting to think about how to bring all that stuff together in a way that sort of equalizes it on some level, or keeps that sort of that sense of importance of the different pieces.
I think, Andrew, thanks so much for sharing all of that in such an eloquent way, and the potential of the things that we are able to do here, because it's a very big task, and I think Brian and I understand that, and it's both something we're kind of pursuing on the side of the work that we're doing. So thanks so much for that. It was very encouraging. So as far as wanting to make sure that we don't lose like the richness, so we're looking to QE to help us kind of bring about a discussion point to people who are in positions of power, right? And then from that, once they perhaps start to ask questions, we can fold in these examples and highlight, and ideally allow those voices, those more specific instances, to be heard. But really, we're just trying to at least now use these models as an opportunity to just get our voice in the door. And get other colleagues and that's the other approach, is that if going to the top doesn't work, we have to build a coalition of our colleagues around us to see it and evaluate for themselves and realize that there's something here and worth looking more into. So that way we can create an opportunity to showcase the stories more and those lived experiences. And more than likely, there will be more people who want to come forward and share those experiences. So there's a lot to go through. I will share that I'm thinking more specifically about like a particular institution and tackling with one, because once we tackle one, then and help that to influence change, then that will be an example for another institution and another. And so it might not be something that will happen like across and make huge change overnight across the whole industry, but making this incremental change. And Brian, I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I think the point you said at the very end is exactly it. I think before the webinar discussed, there is one institution we can think, we can think of that the director is already on board with this kind of work and they already have these internal cultural climate surveys. And I think even applying the model to their internal data in light of some of these broader field related and regional data, that might help them tell a richer story about their own staff. And so using the qualitative to speak quantitatively, but also to assess the current state of things in a way that might be more meaningful on the ground, because those lived experiences are so often lost in the presentation of the data.
Great. So we have David. I have you now.
Always forget to unmute. Yeah, I mean, this is not so much a question as, well, I guess a bit of a shout out and perhaps an invitation, in the sense that, you know, I think this work is great, and I actually hadn't heard that much of the detail of it. I knew that it was going on, but I didn't really know the details of what you guys were doing. And the thing that I want to highlight, I guess, is that there are other folks who've been thinking about what seems like a similar issue in the context of in sort of an indigenous QE. There was a session at the last QE conference about that, and this comes from the work of Meishi, who's here, and Kahiwa Sibre, who is not, I guess, because it's midnight in Australia or something. But the argument there in part was, it's not the whole of it, it's much more complex, and Meishi can do more justice to it, but was in part that there are indigenous communities that whose representations of knowledge, the way they think about what's true and what's worth knowing and understanding, is in the form of stories, and that those interface very badly with the policy world. And it seems like there's a similar thing going on here. It sounds like you're talking about a kind of emancipatory QE, which I think is really cool, in the sense that you're recovering stories, or not recovering, but you're taking stories that people are not otherwise able to hear and trying to use QE to put them in a format where they where they speak with power to the institutions. Right, so there's a mathematical representation, there's a published representation, there's a kind of a culturally accepted representation of things that otherwise appear anecdotal, right? And that's it. And that seems like it's a theme that runs through now a couple of different things, but is actually potentially really, really powerful. And I'm glad to see it happening. And if Meishi wants to add anything, that'd be great. But I do think that there's a space in the community there are more people thinking about this, and it seems like it would be a really good discussion to continue. Meishi, I don't know if you want to add anything. That's it for me. But
yeah, thanks, David. No, thank you, Danielle and Brian, for such an engaging presentation. I could just feel that I don't have much to add. I think the cogs are still turning, and I guess something I'm wondering about is, the power of these collective narratives, right? That could speak to broader trends or broader sort of emotions that folks are experiencing, and have that interface with sort of a reflection of, I think, especially if they are these surveys that I put out of from organizations to say that this could be a tool to reflect back on what's actually happening on the ground with sort of these aggregated experiences. I guess my question or wondering for myself is how do we also ensure that there's the diversity of stories, one, and for it to not flatten, right, what's going on, and how do we think about that? You know, it's important to have collective narratives, but how do we understand the uniqueness of to not flatten, I guess, the data? And then second, in what ways might the kinds of representations now with, you know, epistemic graphs, but what might other forms of representations be that might sort of tell the stories on people's own terms, and what might that look like? And how might that push our thinking of what kinds of representations are out there based on, you know, the lived histories and the kinds of ways of knowing that come from within the people themselves, right? And so those are the two things that I'm just mulling with and thinking about, but I appreciate this presentation so much. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. We have one last question, and then we need to wrap up. So, anyone? Kwai? Sorry.
Oh yeah. Thank you so much, Danielle and Brian. It's wonderful and really a new experience for me. And I was wondering, I just wanted to hear how your experiences have been using QE in your research, specifically in terms of like comparison to the existing analysis methods out there, because some methods are used to perpetuate, you know, the racism or the bias that we have in society. And I was wondering if QE can be used to answer cui bono questions, specifically in terms of like power dynamics and who holds power and where power lies in. So basically a question of asking how was your experience using QE in your research?
We have time for a very short answer.
Yeah, I don't know if Brian, I feel like you know me. Okay, well, I'm actually going to use you as the main example. So, you know, I think again for us, like QE is a good opportunity to provide like a starting point to open up the conversation with people and about the topic, so that way we can share more, people be more interested in wanting to hear the stories, right? And so it provides that visualization that people need to kind of get them interested in the topic, because that's really often what it is. Because usually with these issues, we are preaching to the choir. So how do we engage people to get out of who think that they're not part of the choir, or that it's just a thing, this a passing fad or whatnot, to engage. And so this is where QE is we found to be most valuable, rather than doing like a thematic analysis or other ways of doing it. So I know when Brian, I shared it with him, he was like, it clicked for him so quickly, and I appreciate that so much. And that's kind of what drew him in. And also to see, then he started seeing the potential for using this methodology in other aspects, like doing curriculum comparisons to address pipeline issues, etc. So I think that there's just a lot of power in QE in particular. I don't know if that answered your question.
We hope so, because we need to end the formal part of the meeting anyway. I mean, so people are of course welcome to hang out as long as Brendan keeps the house open here. But this was very interesting, Brian and Danielle. I think we all had a little tour down both an interesting research project that you have told us about, but also a way to use QE that engage more with the community and political issues and so on. So thank you very much for this, and hope to see you next time.